please.
On the 22nd of July, Lord Sedwell, you had a WhatsApp conversation with Simon Case in which you debated what you described as a cunning route into segmentation. Could we have up 303245 at page 10, where you refer to at 1624 the only answer I can see beyond the existing mitigations is Stalinist segmentation. The lockdown hits the young and healthy, virus kills the old and sick. We have to confront that brutal truth and organise for it, notwithstanding CW's. Is that Chris Whitty on this occasion?
I presume so.
Scepticism about the practicalities. And if we go forward to page 11 to set the context, we can see at 11:21, in the middle of the page, Mark said, well, I had a good session with the data people while in Oxford. There might be a cunning route into segmentation if you want to discuss. And then Simon Case says this at 11:24. We agreed with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor yesterday to set up a little cell in the task force to draw up a plan for segmentation. They said they were up for it. And then at 11:29, at the end of your WhatsApp, having described the sort of rating process or the system which might be considered, but I think you mean I don't buy the sage argument that it's all too difficult. Simon Case, neither the Prime Minister nor the Chancellor of the Exchequer buy the sage argument either. I'm just not sure this is a sage issue. This is about political will and implementation of policy, and then personal behaviour, not science. Mark said, well, exactly. Two questions. Firstly, the inquiry's heard evidence about how in August and September the COVID task force looked specifically at the issue of segmentation and whether it was practically possible as, of course, an alternative to the more stringent sort of intervention which might otherwise be utilised. Is this the genesis, do you think, of that policy work done by the COVID task force?
I wouldn't necessarily claim the genesis, but a contribution to it, I would hope.
Secondly, it is clear from Mr. Case's observation, with which you agree with the use of the word exactly, that to the extent that Mr. Case was describing the government's decision to investigate segmentation and describing its political will and the implementation of policy, the government really wasn't following the science here at all. SAGE plainly advises and did advise on the need for shielding, on the epidemiological necessity, and on the epidemiological consequences of shielding. Why were you why were you agreeing that SAGE and its position and its arguments should be dismissed in this way?
Not so much dismissed, but not necessarily accepted without challenge. Shielding, as we discussed earlier, effective shielding would be a crucial element of any segmentation approach, essentially quarantining and protecting those for whom the disease was dangerous, whilst managing its spread, as we've discussed before, through those for whom it was unpleasant. And the differential impact of the disease was even more striking by this point. I think the number of under 50s who'd been hospitalised was even smaller than had been expected, etc. That doesn't, of course, mean younger people, particularly those with comorbidities, weren't at risk, but with sufficient critical care capacity, etc., they could be properly treated, and so that was the question. The reason here was essentially it was again testing whether, now we had better knowledge of the disease, more capabilities in place, was there a way of taking on that different approach? And I think it is right. That is fundamentally a policy question rather than a scientific one. The scientists would have to advise, but you have to take that advice into account whilst working out, is there a policy route through this?
The fact that Sage had advanced an argument at all is evidence, is it not, that the government had asked Sage for its view. You are opining upon the fact that, in your opinion, Sage's argument was that it was too difficult. So you'd ask Sage to address this issue.
I can't recall whether there was the nature of the commission to Sage. I just don't know. It would probably have been through the CMO and the chief scientific advisor. My recollection is that Sage produced some formal advice in early September, I think. I think it came almost at the time of my final cabinet on exactly this question. So there must have been a commission to Sage. I don't know whether that followed from this discussion or whether I was simply inferring from what I knew from Sage that their position at this point.
When you say on this question, do you mean the question of segmentation?
Yes, milady, yeah.
But having asked Sage for its view, however it was commissioned, Sage having proffered its view, having also declared that the government was, in a general sense, and I appreciate it's a general sense, only following the science, it is rather curious that by characterising this debate as a policy or a political issue, Sage's opinion was, in principle, simply rejected as being, well, just too difficult.
I don't think rejected, but I think by that stage the government had actually said, I think in a cabinet meeting in a discussion about 2 metres versus 1 metre distancing, etc., that I think there was more recognition, and of course we were in much calmer waters by this stage, at least temporarily. There was a recognition by ministers that scientific expertise was an input, but wasn't, unlike going into the first lockdown, wasn't necessarily the only determinant of government policy.
All right. Moving on to another topic. The WhatsApps between yourself and Simon Case, in another regard, demonstrated a debate that you had about the process by which Leicester and other places were placed under local restrictions following the exit from the national lockdown. So that is to say, in June and July of 2020. And if we could have up, please, 303-245 at page 7. At 2124, I can't. Ah, yes, thank you very much. Towards the top of the page, Simon Case. Local leaders were refusing to accept the legitimacy of PHE data. Chris Whitty has to argue with Mayor and others earlier today. The legitimacy of the government to be accepted has been so dangerously eroded, it seems, for fairly obvious reasons. Shortly, in what way did you understand Mr. Case to be suggesting that the legitimacy of the government had been eroded? In what way did you understand him to be saying it had been eroded?
I presume that related to the Barnard Castle incident and the government's response to it.
So the Barnard Castle incident, comprising the whole affair and the press conference, was having an impact on the 29th of June in relation to the government's dealings with local mayors.
Yes, I presume that's what we were referring to there. And just on the Barnard Castle incident, I think it isn't fair just to focus on the incident and indeed Mr. Cummings' own press conference. In some ways, that was contained and managed. I don't know whether we're going to come back to this, but I was particularly concerned about the reaction of the Health Secretary and the Attorney General afterwards to it, where I felt they were undermining the legal framework in some of their communications, and we had to get that under control. But I felt the whole fine. But it would have been the whole Barnard Castle incident, not just the incident itself and Mr. Cummings' press conference. It was a broader question, I think.
At 220227, you say the mayor actually a class act, Hancock trying to scapegoat him. Who do you believe? Lord Sedwell, why did you not believe the Secretary of State, himself a minister of the Crown?
I felt, and I know we may come back to this, it felt to me by that point that rather than treating the mayor as essentially a partner in governance, he was being treated as a political opponent, and there was a politicised approach. And this is obviously a very shorthand discussion of the kind one might have on the phone. It's important to remember that. It is only a WhatsApp exchange. And as you see, I'm asking Simon Case, who was obviously on this full time by this stage, what was behind all of that?
I'm not concerned with the debate between Mr. Hancock and the local mayor.
Yeah.
I'm referring specifically to you posing the question, who do you believe? You are putting the candour or the honesty or the reasonableness of the belief in the local mayor or Mr. Hancock into issue. One of them was your colleague, Secretary of State and Minister of the Crown. That is rather surprising, is it not?
Yes, but one was also a senior local government figure. And of course, all of these, if you're the Cabinet Secretary, are important.
Further down the page, we can see at 22:17, you say, be careful of trusting CW's judgment on this. Is that Chris Whitty or Chris Wormold?
I presume Chris Wormold, and I don't quite know why I would have said that, but I presume that's who I'm referring to.
The big problem is Hancock. Then further down the page at 22:21.53, but I mostly blame Hancock. Déjà vu, that was how we spent the early spring. And then Mr. Case says at 22:46, I've only just realised that we have no senior DHSC officials anywhere near this. Where was Matt's Perm Sec or lead DG? We're engaging with the Public Health England, the clinicians, etc., but there is no one around driving the policy side of operational lockdown on Matt's behalf. Weird absence. So, and you say welcome to the last 6 months. So 2 points, please. Firstly, the process by which Mr. Hancock's truthfulness or candour or lack of candour or general approach, however one describes it, and it's obviously a matter for the inquiry, was not an issue that was confined to perhaps one or two individuals, or notably Mr. Cummings. There was a general issue, a general problem surrounding Mr. Hancock. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, and you heard from Helen McNamara on that last week.
And secondly, this issue of where was Matt's Perm Secretary, there's a weird absence. Was there at the same time a problem functionally with the operation of the DHSC insofar as on the civil service side of things, there were failures to produce policy or to stand up and be counted when it came to negotiating policy or producing material that central government and the Cabinet Office and Number 10 requested?
It looks from what Simon Case is saying in that text that's the case. He's clearly concerned that DHSC at an official and expert level is not on top of the Leicester question. I think that was probably the first time that element of it had been drawn to my attention. By then we had the COVID task force, as you said, and I think what this exchange is revealing is just how challenging it was for them as well in dealing with a situation when their Secretary of State is essentially in a quite high-profile political row with the local mayor.
Another topic, you proposed in late May the establishment of COVID-O and COVID-S. We know that because Helen McNamara and Simon Case produced an advice dated the 22nd of May, which recommended the establishment of those committees. And a great deal of evidence has been received by the inquiry in relation to their operation. Why did you propose that there be this division between COVID-S and COVID-O, COVID strategy, COVID operational? And to the extent that COVID-O was concerned with the drawing up of policy and operational matters and everything short of strategizing, was that not duplicative of the COVID task force? as to which we've had considerable evidence from Mr. Ridley as to the broad range of its functions?
COVID-O and COVID-S were cabinet committees, so essentially ministerial committees with officials attending to support. The task force was the official group, essentially combining teams who had hitherto been in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, C19 secretariats, etc., into a single official group. So they were distinct. The task force was the group of officials led by Simon Case, and COVID-O and COVID-S were cabinet committees. There was an obvious risk of duplication between S and O. I wouldn't necessarily, although we called them strategy and operations, in some ways it was the big decisions the Prime Minister needed to be personally involved in COVID-S, and COVID-O those that he could leave to a wider group of ministers, chaired by Michael Gove as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And essentially it replicated the model that we'd applied to Brexit the previous year, where overall Brexit policy was driven in a group chaired by the Prime Minister, XS, and no deal planning, etc., was led in a group chaired by Michael Gove as CDL XO. So it was a straight replica of a model we knew worked for that Prime Minister.
The COVID response machinery was not, of course, the same as the machinery dealing in its entirety dealing with the preparation for a no-deal Brexit.
No. There were echoes, though.
There were overlaps, and of course you took the COVID-O, COVID-S structure from XO and XS. Did you find in reality that there was a degree of duplication between O and S? And in terms of the officials, the non-ministerial officials who attended COVID-O and the CTF, that there was a degree of overlap?
I imagine there was some. I don't recall anyone bringing it to my attention as a problem that needed to be resolved. The task force would have supported both those cabinet committees.
All right. May the inquiry presume that from the need to rearrange the arrangements in the heart of the Cabinet Office in May, from what of course we now know to be the report produced by Helen McNamara in relation to the working practices and the toxicity of the atmosphere and so on and so forth, that there were matters that were fundamentally wrong with the operation of the Cabinet Office between February and May?
I think it's important to look at the sequence there. The task force, COVID-O, COVID-S, were established when we were in calmer waters. We were coming out of the first lockdown, had a much better understanding, etc., and they were planning the future. Whereas when we established the MIGs, we were going into the stall, if you like, of the first lockdown, and of course seeking to accelerate preparations that weren't ready for that lockdown. And so we've got to be careful not to overdo the distinctions between them. They were operating in different circumstances. In terms of the officials and the institutional culture, the first point I should make is the report that Helen McNamara and Martin Reynolds did was triggered by me, and I think the phrase superhero bun fight was actually used by my private secretary with me, and I essentially said, right, we better get onto this. I think there were some reasons for that. Going into the lockdown, into that intense phase, I was conscious that we would lose people. There'd be people off sick, isolating, mental health issues and so on. And therefore I deliberately over-resourced. I deliberately ensured that each DG had a primary function and a sort of understudy function as well, so that when someone became ill, if they weren't able to operate from home, there wouldn't be a break in service, if you like. As people returned to work, there were clearly some tensions around that. Some people had been there throughout. Some people were new. Some people returned after illness. And it was necessary by that stage to restore a more normal way of operating. But I think it was right to over-resource going in. That was certainly my experience of other crises. Worry less about overlaps and more about gaps.
The Prime Minister's own chief advisor has described, as you know well, the Cabinet Office for which you bore ultimate responsibility as a dumpster fire, as being bloated with too many senior levels, too many Director Generals, duplication, confusion, huge numbers of communication and engagement staff. And on the functional side, as essentially failing in its core function, which was to synthesize data, information policy from other government departments, to liaise with them, to broker between them, and to hold the heart of government together. What do you say?
Some of that, but not most of it is fair. As I've explained why there was deliberately some duplication going in, I felt it was necessary to over-resource. I've also heard him say we had the wrong people in the wrong jobs, and yet in particular, the key directors general who worked on COVID clearly had the confidence of the number 10 machine because they were either retained or in some cases promoted into other roles for them. The wider Cabinet Office, outside the Cabinet Secretariat, I don't know whether he was referring to some of that, but we sought to clarify that as we went. It was necessary. We had to set up 36 programmes across government to try and ensure the government was able to respond to the crisis as it moved at pace in March. Inevitably, there was quite a lot of friction around that, and we sought to knock that into shape through the course of March and into April.
You have given evidence in relation to the failure at the heart of government to appreciate that there was an absence of cross-government planning, to bring the departmental planning such as it was into shape and into the centre. There was a failure to appreciate, to become aware in sufficient time of the scale of the crisis. There was only a dawning realisation of the systemic problems at the heart of the DHSC, the primary lead government department at the heart of this public health crisis. Those were all failures which occurred within the Cabinet Office and on your watch. Do you agree?
Yes, and we sought to address them as soon as we realised that we had those issues.
Turning to the Prime Minister, you will be aware, of course, of the evidence received by the inquiry that, in the opinion of his Director of Communications, this was the wrong crisis for this Prime Minister's skill set. And to summarise the criticisms from Mr. Cummings, for all his undoubted political skills, Mr. Johnson's propensity to oscillate, to be unable to manage a cohesive team, and to direct government machinery consistently and effectively. Are those opinions with which you agree?
I recognise them, but I wouldn't express it that way myself. And indeed, I think there's a separate point here, which is essentially, in essence, a question for me, which is, as I said in my witness statement, Mr. Keith, part of my job was to build around any Prime Minister a mechanism or a set of mechanisms that enabled them to both make decisions and then those decisions to be enacted effectively. And I certainly didn't think it would have been responsible to say, oh, well, the Prime Minister's way of working isn't effective in these circumstances, and then throw my hands up. It was my job to make it work.
No one is suggesting otherwise.
No, indeed, no, thank you. So just briefly, one of the reasons I sought to create forcing mechanisms, collective governance mechanisms, was that I knew that the process in number 10 was a dialectic. I'd seen this with the Prime Minister before, notoriously, of course, in 2016, but actually in the autumn of 2019. He would be gung-ho for no-deal Brexit in one moment and much more reflective and trying to identify the landing zone for a deal, particularly in private, say, with me, in another moment. And I recognised that was Lord Lister touched on this, that dialectic is how he got to big decisions. It's exhausting for the people in his inner circle, but my job was to try and ensure that we had a mechanism around that, for which I used essentially the collective governance mechanisms, which would force a decision, and once that decision was made, ensure that the government stuck to it.
You recognise, of course, that there is a considerable amount of evidence from the evening notes from Sir Patrick Vallance, from Mr. Cummings's evidence, from the evidence of officials and advisors in Downing Street in the Cabinet Office, that there were problems concerning Mr. Johnson's leadership, his oscillation, his ability to build an effective and cohesive team. To the extent that your obligation was to build a system around him that would enable proper decision making, facilitate his job as Prime Minister, doesn't the fact that these complaints and these concerns continued throughout February, March, April, May, all the way through to the end of 2020 show that your attempts to build a corrective system failed?
I don't agree with that. They're complaining about how he got to decisions and how he operated with his inner circle. And I didn't think there was any way I could change that. This was the way he operated. My job was essentially to create a system which insulated the rest of Whitehall and turned whatever process of getting to a decision in the centre of government into regular government decisions and business. And the main mechanisms I used for that, as I said, was trying to ensure the last group of people from whom he would hear would be his cabinet colleagues and in collective agreement. I didn't think I could address the underlying question. That was just going to happen. My job was to take that and try and make sure that the rest of the system worked nonetheless.
The very fact that the Cabinet Secretary has to insulate his own Prime Minister, the Prime Minister, from the rest of Whitehall is a sorry reflection of the workings of government at that level.
It was a very challenging period, but as I said, my job was not to judge the way a Prime Minister makes a decision. They're democratically elected. It was to try to ensure that however they got to the decisions and however much stray voltage there was at the centre, and there was an awful lot, that the system of government worked. And I sought to try and achieve that, particularly on the big decisions the government took going into and coming out of the lockdowns.
My suggestion to you, Lord Sedwell, is that to a large extent your worthy efforts failed. Notably, in August 2020, Sir Patrick Vallance records in his evening notes these words: Sedwell came back saying, "This administration is brutal and useless." Did you say those words?
I don't recall doing so, and I can't actually recall what might have prompted it, but I have no doubt, I don't doubt Sir Patrick's memory. It must have been a moment of acute frustration with something. I don't know what.
303245, some further WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr. Case in May 2020, page 1. We don't need to go through them all in detail, but if you look at, by way of example, 082932, Mr. Case and you are debating whether or not he is prepared to do a job in Downing Street. He says, "I'm not willing to agree to do any job back in this version of the centre without guarantees, honest conversations with the PM about behaviours. I'll work for you and the PM, I will not work for Dom." There are then repeated references to you saying, "Reinforcing my conversation with the PM about behaviours, very helpful." Simon Case, there are guarantees about behaviour. At 2225, he says, "I'm appalled that the PM has done all this and caused all of this damage." That's 222532, thank you. And on pages 2, 6 and 9 of this group, there are further references to the behaviour in Downing Street, the people that the Prime Minister has surrounded himself with, references to them being so mad, they're madly self-defeating. I've never seen a bunch of people less well equipped to run the country. Who, when you said these people, were you and Mr. Case referring to?
Did I say these people? I'm not sure. I think anyway.
The PM and the people he chooses to surround himself with are basically feral. You say,
Right.
I've got the bite marks.
Yeah. Well, that's
Who are those people?
Well, as you will see, Mr. Keith, there is sometimes some gallows humour in some of these WhatsApps. I think so. These exchange, that first exchange came after a point where there'd been very severe friction between me and the Prime Minister and his immediate team. Martin Reynolds' witness statement refers to it, although the Prime Minister at no point expressed a loss of confidence. This is a little later. I think this is the Prime Minister and some of his immediate team. And
we can take the document off the screen, thank you.
Lord Lister referred to some of this yesterday.
It is apparent from Mr. Case's hesitation at taking the job of being Permanent Secretary Number 10 and ultimately Cabinet Secretary that the behaviour, as he perceived it and as you perceived it, of people in Downing Street was positively affecting his willingness to take that role. You were aware that the behaviour, whatever it was, and from whomsoever it was coming, was affecting the stability of the working arrangements in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office. You were aware that it was affecting the stability of the civil service at the highest point of government.
Correct. Sorry.
Yes. Those were very serious matters indeed, given particularly that the government was in the maw of the beast facing this crisis.
Correct. I think you put to Lord Lister yesterday a remark from me in another WhatsApp with Simon Case, in which I think I say something like, it is difficult to get people to march to the sound of gunfire if you shoot them in the back. That is a strong statement about the institutional culture.
And I want to be clear about this pervasive atmosphere, the behaviour, the working practices, they were having, were they not, a direct impact on the efficacy, the efficiency of the system, the ability of the government to make proper, timely and appropriate decisions.
We sought to minimise the real effect on the big decisions, and we discussed that a few moments ago. I thought that was my job to do that. So there was no doubt it was a very stressful issue, the institutional behaviour at the centre, the stray voltage, etc. I think, broadly speaking, in terms of the really big decisions, the timeliness of them, given that that government and other governments who didn't have that behaviour right at the centre made decisions, broadly speaking, at the same time, I think there's a question as to whether we were not successful in ensuring that actually the right decisions were taken at the right time, notwithstanding the particular challenges of that regime.
Another issue was the absence of female perspective. 303-245, page 10. Mark said, well, PP's interjection, is that a reference to Priti Patel?
Yes.
A reminder that we need more of the female perspective. That's at 16:24:28. Just before the gap. Thank you very much. And Helen McNamara, in her evidence, or rather in her written statement, has noted that there was in government, in Number 10, a striking absence of humanity or perspective about people or families or how people actually lived. Would you agree?
Yes, and I did bring this up in one of the, it may even be, Mr. Keith, in one of the documents we've already looked at. I recall commenting about lockdowns, that the experience of lockdown for those lucky enough to have a garden, a laptop, a cardo, etc., was wholly different to that of a single mother living in a bedsit with a cleaning job across town. I was acutely concerned about that.
And turning lastly in this context to Mr. Hancock himself, as I promised I would. Mr. Cummings says that at one point you said to him, the British system does not work if ministers lie. And the document 303245, WhatsApp messages between you and Simon Case, again at page 3, shows that you and he discussed 1911-04. You say totally incompetent. They don't even understand the regulations they authorise. At page 5, you refer to the DHSC's laissez-faire attitude. This is 1101. It's 1108. It's been quite a pattern. Matt over-promising, under-delivering, and Chris on the touch line. I had hoped we'd corrected it. And on page 7, there are references by you to Hancock all over the place and to questions about his candour and his grip, as well as his tendency to overpromise. Give us, please, an understanding of how damaging, how destructive this loss of confidence in Mr. Hancock was in the context of the United Kingdom government facing a health crisis of this magnitude, and there being a fundamental lack of confidence in the ability of the Secretary of State for Health to do what was required.
Clearly damaging. And I did raise, I don't remember the exact terms, I didn't keep contemporaneous notes. I did raise really 3 questions with the Prime Minister throughout those months. One was about Mr. Hancock's candour, and you heard from Chris Wormold, you've just referenced it, over-promising, overconfident, over-assurance. We had to use the Programme Management Office to double-check what we were being told so that we could try and make sure there wasn't an effect in terms of, we did understand whether programmes were actually on track as we were hearing, for example. And some of that continued. The second issue was this question of, particularly after the Barnard Castle incident, of politicisation, where I expressed myself at a time when my own relations with the Prime Minister were quite strained, as you have seen, quite sharply about the risk to the legal framework that public statements from the Health Secretary and indeed the then Attorney General were making. And I felt we saw some more of that in the Leicester affair. And then I did have a conversation with the Prime Minister in the summer. These are very normal and except in the circumstances of this inquiry, entirely private conversations between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary and in this case, the number 10 Permanent Secretary. But obviously I understand the unique circumstances of the inquiry about whether he was the right person to lead the next phase, whatever the PM's judgment about him, on the basis that I'd already said I felt structural reform of health and social care was necessary.
You told the Prime Minister to sack Mr. Hancock.
I don't think I used that word with him, but I did use it in a WhatsApp with Simon Case.
And you described it thus: to save lives and protect the NHS.
That was gallows humour. That's an echo. I mean, and I realise, of course, inappropriate even in a private exchange. Not something I would have ever expected to be public. I was echoing the. It was gallows humour, echoing the slogan, the communications of the earlier on. So,
but it was
that is not to be overinterpreted.
No, but the words, I told the Prime Minister to sack Mr. Hancock, reflect the seriousness of the position and the grave position in which the government had found itself with being unable to have confidence in its Secretary of State.
That would have followed the conversation I would have had with the Prime Minister about whether a change would be right for the next phase. Of course, as I said, I had raised my concerns with the Prime Minister. That was not intended for him to remove Mr. Hancock, but to take a a grip on the issue. In the end, the Prime Minister has to make these judgments.
As it happens, in his witness statement to this inquiry at paragraph 699, Mr. Johnson says, "I did not have any concerns regarding the performance of any cabinet minister, including Matt Hancock. I do not think that I received any advice from Sir Mark Sedwell that Matt should be removed." What do you say to that?
I can see how he might remember it that way. I did not provide formal advice to the Prime Minister. So there are occasions when a Cabinet Secretary has to give advice to a Prime Minister about the status of a minister, particularly if there's been a breach of the ministerial code. And I did have to give both Prime Ministers I served advice in that way. So that's formal advice, written, etc. These were, as I've just expressed, conversations about Mr. Hancock. I don't think I would have used the word sack with the Prime Minister himself, although I acknowledge I said it to Mr. Case. But he would have been under no illusions as to my view about what was best.
You left him under no doubt whatsoever that he would be better advised to replace Mr. Hancock with another minister as Secretary of State for Health.
Indeed.
A different topic, almost there, Lord Sedwell. Legislation. The inquiry understands that the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 was not used as a basis for the COVID legislation or regulations. As it happened, the main Coronavirus Act was passed by Parliament on the 25th of March and received royal assent the same day. It had been through every stage in the House of Commons and the House of Lords on a single day, the 23rd of March. In the event, the government used, in England at any rate, the Public Health Control of Diseases Act 1984 as the overarching legislation under which to promulgate the statutory instrument, the secondary legislation that was the coronavirus regulations. So firstly, having passed the coronavirus bill and it having passed into law as the Act, why was the 1964 Act used as the overarching legislation for the main coronavirus legislation, regulations?
The Coronavirus Act went beyond that, so there were other provisions in it.
There were.
In that specific case, I think at the time, it was because we were already essentially more familiar with the Public Health Act. There was a need to move extremely quickly to put those into law and create the legal certainty, in particular, the police needed to enforce the regulations. So a judgment was just made that it would be simpler and give better legal clarity to use existing rather than brand new legislation that hadn't yet essentially been fully implemented.
The inquiry is curious because it's received evidence in Module 1, of course, that a great deal of time and energy was devoted to a pandemic flu bill. That then became the coronavirus bill, which then became the Act. But in the actuality, in the event, it wasn't even used for the primary regulations in those first few days.
No, the Public Health Act was, and on reflection, it may have been possible to have drafted a different version of the coronavirus bill so that the powers didn't overlap between the two pieces of legislation.
And the Civil Contingencies Act wasn't used, was it because of the very unusual and draconian nature of the powers in Part 2 of that Act, which require ministers, if they use that Act to issue regulations, to appoint emergency coordinators for each part of the United Kingdom. And obviously there are very real concerns about the civil liberties aspects of such a step. Was that what caused ministers to shy from using the Civil Contingencies Act and instead then to use the Coronavirus Act and the Public Health Act?
It would have been a factor. Another factor, though, and probably the more important, was that the Civil Contingencies Act is only to be used if there is no legislative alternative, in a sense, if there's simply no time, because it allows ministers to make essentially make law by decree. And then, of course, that has to be reviewed by Parliament at a very regular intervals. But the underlying premise is that can only happen if there simply isn't the time or opportunity to create an alternative vehicle, and for the reasons you set out, there was in this case.
Finally, you had, of course, as you have indicated, a most difficult conversation with Mr. Johnson on or around the 14th of May 2020, when you agreed to move on later in the year to end being Cabinet Secretary in September. Regardless of the whys and wherefores of how you came to agree to such a move or why it happened, do you think that the means of your departure, the nature of that decision and that meeting, and the way in which you came to leave, affected the stability of the civil service and the higher echelons of government?
I should just note, just for the record, the decision wasn't taken in that meeting. There was a discussion in that meeting. For the reasons you said, I think there's no need to go through all of the toing and froing. A lot of it is in the WhatsApps and other messages. The final decision, which I took, was in early June.
Right.
And with his agreement. And that goes to the point you've raised. I was conscious that the departure of a Cabinet Secretary, particularly, although we were in a calmer period, but particularly in these circumstances, would undoubtedly be destabilising. And many of my colleagues urged me to stay on, fight through the next set of pressure and stick it out. I was also conscious, however, having had over a year of it, that it was also destabilising for the system to have constant hostile attacks on the Cabinet Secretary and also the office of the Cabinet Secretary. And that predated Mr. Johnson, but it was particularly his government, but it had become particularly acute. Distortions, leaks, some cases just things that were simply untrue. There was a story put out that in his absence, I had conspired with I don't know who to postpone the implementation of Brexit. I mean, completely untrue, completely untrue. And so I was conscious that that was also destabilising for the civil service, and this First Division Association and others talked about that. And in the end, it was personally wearing as well. There's only so much lightning any lightning conductor can take. But in the end, I concluded that a fresh Cabinet Secretary appointed by that Prime Minister and his team, they'd have to stop that those anonymous attacks, etc., would have to stop. And therefore, I felt that might be the opportunity for a fresh start. And so on balance, I concluded for both professional as well as personal reasons that it was the right time to go.
But those attacks were internecine. They were coming from your own side.
Yes.
Helen McNamara says in her statement, and perhaps we should give her the final word, it made those in the civil service in the centre less confident about challenging. No one was safe if the Cabinet Secretary was not, and dealing with the unravelling preoccupied a number of us for critical weeks. Mr. Cummings says it was a bomb. From a government level, it kind of kicked week after week after week of debilitating argument across the system. Putting aside the issue of whether or not he was entitled to express that view at all, would you agree with the sentiments of both those witnesses?
I would, but as I said, there was the countervailing factor of what the destabilising behaviour already, and that's why I made the judgment I did that it was the right time to go.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Keith.
Just before, there are some questions from call participants, but just before, at the risk of indulging in another seminar, as I nearly did with Lord Lister yesterday, in times of national emergency, I'm afraid, I think I probably speak on behalf of the average citizen, I just assumed there would be structures in place that suddenly you would have whether it's COBRA for a national emergency, but there'd be other structures beneath the main structure that would just slip into place. But I'm not getting the feeling that that's what happened. You ended up with the ministerial implementation groups, and then they got replaced by the task force COVID-O, COVID-S. Should there be a system whereby there is in the Cabinet manual, in times of national emergency, this is what's going to happen, so that everybody knows where they're going and what they're going to be doing?
Yes, I think there should. I think it's important, my lady, to remember the scale of this crisis. This was the biggest crisis the country had faced since World War II, and government is reshaped by crises of that scale. It's inevitable that it will be. And for the most part, the crisis management machinery for whether it's for floods or terrorist attacks or foot and mouth, etc., works reasonably well. And there's a very big question for governments about how much resource they're prepared to devote to contingent capability, and we discussed
Buying insurance.
Yeah, exactly. But we discussed the kind of capabilities that did not exist in health and social care. Those are not trivial capabilities in which to invest, and of course, in many cases, those capabilities are still not there if we were hit by another pandemic today, for example. So those are big choices. I do think, though, my lady, there is your point is a good one. That I think the Cabinet Manual should have more material on this so that it's more familiar to the whole of government, not just the crisis experts, if you like. And I think, for example, if we take the example of the MIGs, it's obviously a matter for you, but if we were faced by another crisis of this scale, having a group looking at the issue itself, in this case health, having a group looking at public services and their impact and continuity of public services, having a group looking at the economy, having a group looking at the international, those would be sensible ways to organise ourselves, frankly, whatever we call them, and making sure the devolved administrations are properly engaged. I think the same is true as well. Obviously, one needs to make those things work effectively, and we had to amend as we went. But I agree that this is something that government, I hope, has already learnt some lessons ahead of your own, my lady, about this, and I hope some of that work is in hand.
But when you have those different committees, I mean, there's so much overlap, and having got used to having meetings involving, dare I say it, officials, I know that before any meeting takes place, there's probably an officials meeting, and then there's probably a pre-briefing meeting and a briefing meeting. And if you have all these different committees, so public services is one MIG, and then health is another. Well, isn't health a public service? I mean, they overlap in so many different ways, don't they?
Well, we drew
involve duplication.
We drew up the terms of reference so that there were fairly clear boundaries between them. And in truth, the move from the MIGs to COVID-0 in particular, there was slightly less to that than has sometimes been apparent, in that the international one was wrapped back into the National Security Council, which hadn't really met, and the economic one was wrapped into the government's existing economic committee, cabinet committee, which also hadn't met. Regrettably, that meant that the DAs were no longer directly involved in the same way. So in some ways, it was a merger of the health and public services MIGs was really what happened with the creation of the COVID-0 structure. And I think there's just a judgment about the phasing of this. I think going into the lockdown, there was so much work to do across government because we didn't have all the plans and programmes we needed. There were 3 dozen programmes, of which a minority were in health, across the whole of government. If it had been a single ministerial committee trying to deal with all of that, they would have been in constant session. But you're right, Malone, it's a judgment about how you divvy things up, when you put them together, and obviously trying to make sure that the culture is of collaboration and high trust and so on, so that the boundaries are interfaces, not barriers.
And when you've divided, I think I might have said my final question, but anyway, my inquiry, I'll change the rules. When you have different bodies doing different aspects, how do you make sure that the final decision makers on obviously the most important, the key decisions, which is what Module 2 is all about, that they do have all the factors there that they can balance, so that you have obviously the SAGE advice, the economic advice, the socio-economic advice, the health advice. How do you, as Cabinet Secretary, ensure that your ultimate decision maker, Prime Minister and Cabinet or decision makers, get all those balancing factors and that the sufficient weight is paid to all of them?
The key to that, my lady, is that it is Cabinet, or at least a Cabinet committee in which the key departments involved are represented, so that for example, the impact of any decision on the provision of benefits, it's really important the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions is in the room at the table, and he or she will have been briefed by their department, not just on what they think about the main crisis, but on what the impact would be for them and how they're going to manage it. The same with the Treasury, obviously, and others. So the departmental structure means that ministers should be coming both as members of the cabinet, but advocates for the sector or sectors for which they are responsible, and that all of that input is brought into a collective decision. That's why collective decision making is generally better than decisions being made by a small cohort right at the very centre.
You've preempted what would be my final comment, not question, which is, but that does depend on the collective decision-making taking place.
Indeed.
Right. Sorry to have preempted some of our questions. Ms Mitchell, I think you're going next.
Lord Sedwill, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company for the Scottish COVID bereaved. I too wish to ask some questions about structures in place and making sure that the devolved administrations are properly engaged, which is what you've just reflected on. You've identified in your evidence so far that you sought to build strong relationships between the devolved administrations, both institutional and personal. And you indicated that you had conversations, for example, with Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister. What I would like to know is, was there then, or is there now, any formal structure or forum for you as Cabinet Secretary to liaise with the heads of the civil service of the devolved administrations?
Yes, there's at the governmental level, as you'll be very familiar, the Joint Ministerial Committee that brings them all together. The permanent secretaries for the Scottish, Welsh governments and Northern Ireland were all part of the wider permanent secretaries group. So it's known as Wednesday morning colleagues for reasons that are obvious. It just meets on a Wednesday. And I would always include them in, they were always, as of right, included in those meetings. It wasn't something I decided. I would also have sort of informal get-togethers with the permanent secretaries of the devolved administrations, because there were particular, in smaller groups, just the 3 or 4 of us, because there were obviously particular issues of concern to them. So there was the overarching structure, which almost replicated cabinet plus DAs, and then informal meetings as well.
Well, I think you've probably preempted my next question, because my next question was about whether or not there were structures that you would like to have been in place during the first period, the most, I suppose, difficult and fast-moving period of COVID striking our shores. And I ask that in particular because we're aware that the joint ministerial committees were not being used.
No, they weren't, but the ministerial cobras, I think almost all, I think maybe even all, in that phase included devolved administration ministers, and the staff work behind that at official level will certainly have done so. So I think in that phase, the liaison with the devolved administrations, recognising that we were trying to move in lockstep in many areas which were devolved, but maintain coordination. I think that worked pretty well. And of course, they had their own chief medical officers and other, and they would meet as a group as well. So I think the connective tissue in that first phase was pretty strong at official level, at chief medical officer level. And as I said, the cobras were UK cobras.
Can I ask, did that happen by happenstance, or was there formal decision taken to form it that way?
I think it wouldn't have occurred to me to do it any other way. I don't recall anyone challenging it, certainly at that stage, and had they done so, I would have replied robustly that this was necessary.
If I can move on to another topic now, and that's in relation to communications between the devolved administration and the UK government. If I could have up on the screen inquiry number 000250229, and that's paragraph 147, page 39. What you say in just that first paragraph was, I was conscious that, notwithstanding their divergent political agenda and differing styles of governance, the Prime Minister and the devolved administration First Ministers had reached much the same conclusion about the timing and nature of the first lockdown, its socio-economic mitigations and its release. Now, also you gave evidence this morning where you were being asked about when the decision for lockdown had been taken, and you were asked when that had been, and you responded by agreeing to a proposition that my learned friend had put to you and said, I presume that parallel processes were happening in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. There was a lot of communication between them. What I'm just wanting to check is it the communication between the devolved administrations themselves or communications between the devolved administration and the UK government?
Both. Okay. I would have imagined that they might be talking among the three about all of their relationships with the UK government, just given the obvious disparity. But there was certainly extensive and I think almost constant communication between officials in supporting ministers going into those meetings. When I said parallel processes, I think we were talking about the decisions the Prime Minister reached over some of those crucial days. What I meant by that was I assumed that, for example, the First Minister in Scotland would be with her team saying, right, what do we need to do? What's the situation in Scotland? London was further ahead than the rest of the country. She probably asked whether Scotland was a bit behind and did she have more time? I don't know, but that's the kind of thing I would have expected. And then it was brought together in the ministerial UK COBRAs, which made the formal decisions and where the heads of all of the administrations were able to liaise. But there would have been intensive official contact beforehand.
Indeed, thank you. Were you aware of any representations from the Scottish Government to introduce a mandatory lockdown prior to the date of lockdown, the 23rd March 2020?
No, nor indeed from anyone else.
I've got no further questions, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. Mr Dale, I think you're going next. Don't worry about Mr Dale understands if you don't face him. Oh. You'll take your voice away from the microphone if you turn around.
Maybe I'll turn for the question, my lady, if that's okay.
Thank you, my lady. Lord Sedwill, I ask questions on behalf of FEMO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organizations. I have three short sets of questions. As you may know, there were press reports of a disproportionate death rate for COVID within Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities during the early stages of the pandemic. For example, The Guardian of April 10th reported that the first 10 doctors to die were from BAME background. So my first question is, how seriously was this issue taken at the Cabinet Office, if there was indeed awareness of this issue during the months of March and April 2020?
Thank you. I think going into the first lockdown, of course, it was country and society-wide. So in a sense, there was no discussion about whether there would be different kinds of measures taken for different groups on ethnic or indeed other grounds. It was certainly a feature in considering the mitigations for the lockdown. So as we were developing programs to deal with the consequences of lockdown for different groups, we were certainly conscious of it. And as you say, their evidence did start to be made available quite early about differential impact. It was quite challenging to understand whether that evidence was telling us something about whether the virus had a purely ethnic differential impact that to do with ethnicity, or the degree to which that was overlain by social factors such as multi-generational households, denser living, and so on. But certainly in mitigating the lockdown and in considering measures to come out, we were conscious of those factors, and we were particularly conscious of the enforcement mechanisms. I recall in early April seeing some quite sobering data that suggested, I think in London, for example, it was one of the ethnic minority communities, I can't remember exactly which, had a much higher incidence of enforcement from the Metropolitan Police than the population as a whole, and that was clearly a concern, and of course not for the first time had one heard that kind of concern about the relations between police and certain communities. So we were conscious of all of these things.
Very well. My second question, which I hope is not too much of a tutorial question, is what were the mechanisms, formal and informal, for issues affecting certain population groups being raised with senior decision makers?
In normal circumstances, for a major policy decision, there would have to be an equality impact assessment. And that is a standard process that involves consultation, interaction with community groups, academic research, etc., in order to make sure that a final decision by ministers on a policy matter properly understands and encompasses the potential impact on ethnic minorities, but also other protected groups, whether for gender, sexuality, whatever it might be. Going into the lockdown, of course, there was no time to be able to do any of that. And formal equality impact assessments are quite an involved process. So even as we were coming out, it wouldn't have been possible to do them in a timely way in the what one might call the full fat version of an equality impact assessment. But I certainly would have expected the policy work, and I believe this was the case, to take account of those factors as choices were being put to ministers about, for example, that release of that first lockdown, which would have covered social, economic, ethnic, and other factors, so that there was essentially an intelligent consideration of those.
Thank you. And my third and final question, which hopes for a clarification on a point of fact. How did the issue of disparate impacts on Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities reach senior decision makers, if it did?
It would be through the policy process. So one wouldn't have a parallel process for this. I mean, of course, there'd be informal feedback. I mentioned in answer to one of Mr. Keith's questions earlier, I think the role of cabinet ministers as constituency MPs as well as ministers, and that's a mechanism by which they can bring that they can bring that perspective. But the policy process itself is designed to include those factors, and therefore decisions coming to cabinet or the prime minister or ministers should encompass all of those factors. That's what a good policy process is designed to do.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Dell. Mr. Freeman's just there.
Good afternoon. I'm going to ask questions for 4 national disabled people's organisations. In July 2020, before leaving post, you gave a final valedictory lecture at Oxford University, and it's exhibited at paragraph 150 of your statement, in which you endorsed the need to build back better, especially given COVID's adverse effect on what you called the poorest and most vulnerable in society. I could see you nodding, so you recall. On that, we want to ask you firstly about consultation with groups from outside government, and secondly about the way that government is internally organised when it comes to considering inequalities. So first on outside consultation. There's a report from the Institute for Government that was in your evidence pack, and it's titled Decision Making in Crisis, First Responses to the Coronavirus Pandemic. It's up there, and can we go to page 50, please? I want to look at the top paragraph first, and the recommendation as to bringing representatives of those affected by a decision into the room compensates for imperfect information. It is inevitable in a crisis that decision-making is centralised to some degree, as ministers want to act quickly and take control, but bringing non-government partners inside the tent helps compensate for the uncertainty created by imperfect information in a crisis, as well as building trust and creating allies to explain and defend policies. And then just down into the next paragraph, examples are then given as to those who would benefit from, in its words, being brought into the tent, and their things and organisations like business groups and unions with regard to decisions. That creates a benefit of knowing about ground intelligence and goodwill and trust. So, firstly, do you agree with that recommendation? And as you said in your own final lecture, in particular, that government should work much more to, I'm going to use your words, co-design its policies with those affected by them?
The short answer is yes. And I think the IFG report sets it out very well. We didn't touch on it in detail in my earlier evidence, but as we were planning the release from the first lockdown, a major part of that was engagement. Sorry, I won't look around from the microphone. Was engagement with businesses and other representative groups to create the Safer Workplaces programme. That was one of those 36 programmes I referred to. And of course, that should, as I said earlier to the earlier question, in any good policy process, involve engagement with other representative groups, including, of course, of different, and particularly in these circumstances, different groups of the most vulnerable in society. But co-design, absolutely, I believe better policy results from that.
And you've effectively preempted my second question, but just to make clear to my lady, because in a sense, the reference to business groups and unions might be described as old-style corporatist references. I mean, all policies presumably speak to business groups and unions. But I think, you've made a face. Maybe they don't enough. That's another set of questions. But I think you're making clear, are you not, that especially in what we are looking at in this inquiry, it is now high time to develop those kind of enhanced approaches and to consultation and engagement with representatives from civil society social groups such as disabled peoples and, of course, others that are represented in this inquiry. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I would hope with modern technology it is easier perhaps to do that in a more dynamic way than perhaps would have been through traditional methods, but the fundamental point is one I agree with.
Can I then turn to internal government, I'm going to say again structures, back to that, but a more particular question. The inquiry is aware of how the machinery of government divides responsibilities for categories of inequality across a range of ministerial portfolios with no dedicated Department of State. So, for instance, we're just about to hear from Mr. Tomlinson, the previous Minister for Disabled People, who was located in a junior position in the Department of Work and Pensions, with no direct leadership of the Cabinet Disability Unit, and other core participants who, for instance, act for children, race and ethnic minorities, and violence against women and girls can point to variants of the same problem. In terms of building back better, would the future solution lie in the creation of an equality department with a Secretary of State, or would you suggest some other structure and change of approach?
I think I would leave the decisions on Departments of State for governments to take. I think it is they reflect the priorities and the way that a Prime Minister wishes to organise government, the manifesto on which they're elected. And I think I shouldn't presume to second-guess that, because that would be something that would be, as I say, subject to a manifesto and an election. The reason for having ministers not necessarily co-located in a department with, for example, the units, and you mentioned the disabled unit, is because the responsibility moves between ministers regrettably too quickly, but that's been a feature of our system recently. And what we didn't want to do was move departmental units around. And so there was a decision taken some years ago to essentially create some stability in the units responsible for these various issues, whilst allowing Prime Ministers to appoint a Minister for the Disabled, a Minister for Women, a Minister for other groups, and support them wherever they might be located. Again, it's a judgment call. One can make a case for doing it differently. There's clearly a case, as you suggest, for a Department of Equality, but I'm afraid I will punt that one into the political level of decision making because it must reflect the priorities of an incoming government.
Last question on that. If that's your stance, and we understand why you would take that stance, is it fair to say that the nature of the system as it was in COVID did pose some challenges for holistic views, for instance, to those who were socially vulnerable and the likes of the matters that we raised in the first set of questions?
Undoubtedly it posed challenges, but I think if you look at the material exhibited alongside my witness statement, I think every cabinet discussion, for example, of COVID referenced the impact on vulnerable groups. And we weren't just thinking about the medically vulnerable to COVID itself. Actually, the reason I brought Simon Case in, the first job I asked him to do when he came in from the royal household, was to set up a programme of support for the groups we call essentially the socially vulnerable. In other words, not those who are medically vulnerable to COVID, but who were socially vulnerable to the impact of lockdown. And we wanted to make sure we had programmes in place to support them as well. So I think it ran through the work we were doing. But of course, it'll be for Milady to judge. I think maybe in the course of a later module about its effectiveness. But certainly there was an attempt throughout, at least my period, that first lockdown, etc., to ensure we were considering and supporting the most vulnerable groups in society.
So just so we can be clear, though, your concerted work on that started with Simon Case coming in to partner on that?
No, that was when he came in to essentially give some additional heft to a programme we'd already begun. We set up, I think almost in parallel, programmes. We discussed the shielding programme earlier, but programmes to support, provide necessities, etc., to the medically vulnerable who needed a particularly stringent form of lockdown, quarantine, in effect quarantine. But we also recognise there were many people with complex needs, for whom lockdown generally would be challenging, and we set up a separate programme for that. Simon took that on, but it predated him.
Thank you, Milady.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. That completes the questions.
It does.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Sobel. Thank you very much for staying for as long as you have and for your patience. I hope we haven't trespassed upon it too much.
Thank you, Milady.
Right, we need to break now. I shall return at 20 past. Sorry to keep you waiting, Mr. Thompson.
Lady, can we call Justin Tomlinson, please?
Okay.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing
but the truth.
I undertake we will complete your evidence today, having kept you waiting.
That's a promise, a guarantee we will finish today. Thank you so much for making yourself available today. Thank you for your patience this morning and waiting. And thank you for your statement and assisting the inquiry with its investigations. Just a few things before we start. If we both can keep our voices up. Secondly, avoid over-speaking, because there's a note being kept of your evidence. And pace of answers. If we can try and monitor that pace and not speak too fast, I think it will assist the record, which has been kept. Your statement received before us, and thank you for providing that. It's dated 7th of August 2023, with 67 exhibits, and you've had an opportunity to see that, and you signed that statement with a declaration that it's true to the best of your belief and knowledge. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. In relation to why you are here to assist the inquiry, it's regarding your role as Minister for Disabled People, Health and Work, and you held that role between January 2020 and the 16th of September 2021. So the 3 lockdowns was during the period when you held that position. And to assist you, I want to outline how we're going to deal with your oral evidence today, building upon your written evidence. 2 parts. First part is structural, dealing with your role as a Minister of State, the disability unit, which we'll discuss in a moment, and how that fits into governmental decision-making. It shouldn't take us too much time. That's the first part. The second part, I want to explore some key events with you and we'll deal with it in chronological order. And there's 3 broad themes I want you to consider, and then we will cover them as we go through that time period. Firstly, visibility. Was there sufficient visibility, insight, and data regarding the needs of disabled people during the pandemic? Secondly, engagement. Was the engagement that was undertaken, and there was engagement which was undertaken, was that sufficient? And did that fit into decision making? And lastly, delay. Were the needs of disabled people sufficiently and promptly considered during the pandemic? So there are 3 areas I'd like us to cover in part 2. I know your statement covers the other areas. And the last promise today, you've had one already, is that at the end I'll give the opportunity to add anything you think which is significant to assist inquiry with its investigations when we deal with lessons learned. Okay? Briefly, your professional background, we see at paragraph 5 of your statement. You became an MP in 2010, Member of Parliament. 2015, you were appointed by the then Prime Minister David Cameron to serve as the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Disabled People. That's at paragraph 6. Then at paragraph 7, we know that you rejoined government as a minister within the Department of Work and Pensions. First as an Undersecretary, and then later as a Minister of State, a Minister for Disabled People Health in April 2019. And that's the role we're going to ask you about. So you had been in position in that role before the pandemic took place. So against that background, part 1, structure. So the role of minister, firstly, the Minister for Disabled People and Health and Work, it's within the Department of Work and Pensions. I think you were described, you may not have heard, as of having a junior position a short time ago, but it was the second most senior ministerial position within the DWP, is that correct?
That's right. So the first time I served as the Minister for Disabled People, I was a Parliamentary Under-Secretary. When I returned the second time, the role had been upgraded to Minister of State, so I was in effect number 2 in the Department of Work and Pensions.
And the Secretary of State, the most senior minister within that department and at cabinet level, was Theresa Coffey at that stage. And in terms of the size of the group disabled people that interests you are seeking to represent is huge.
Yes.
I'm just going to draw upon a document which is within your exhibits, but 21% of people in Britain are disabled. That's 14.1 million people. And of that, 8% are children, and 19% of the working age population, and 44% of the pension age adults category.
Just to be clear, that's disabled all those with long-term health conditions. And it's predominantly bodies and minds can't quite keep up with us with age, because what surprises a lot of people is the prevalence later in age rather than necessarily born with either of those.
Yes.
And you said 21% in Britain. I don't know how precise we have to be. By that, do you mean England, Wales, Scotland, or just England?
Yes.
It's my terminology. I think we should say the United Kingdom. I was quoting the exhibit.
So it is United Kingdom, includes Northern Ireland.
There is variations. So there's a greater prevalence in Wales and possibly Scotland. I can't really remember, but certainly 1 in 5 was the stat that we would generally use.
We may see, and we may touch upon that document in a moment, but on any basis, as you say, 1 in 5, a substantial proportion of the population. And in terms of your role as that minister, if you could bring up paragraph 2A, so go back to page 1, please. Thank you very much. Thank you. Your responsibilities as Minister of State. It says some specific disability policy and cross-government responsibility for disabled people. Can I focus on that just for a moment? When you say some specific disability responsibility, what do you mean? Why the qualification?
So, for example, I was solely responsible for disability benefits. At that time, that would amount to about £13.6 billion worth of government expenditure. That was predominantly through my DWP role.
Yes.
But in other areas, I would make representations on behalf of disabled people to other responsible departments. So, for example, if I'd had a stakeholder meeting and they raised accessible train stations, then I would relay that to the Department for Transport, who are ultimately responsible for how accessible stations are or aren't.
So to use your terminology in the statement, you in effect were the champion of disability rights within
Yes.
government.
Yeah.
The second part of your role I want to touch upon is oversight of the DU, that's the disability unit. We'll touch upon that in a moment. Perhaps we can deal with that now. It's at paragraph 9 of your statement. And you describe the disability unit. And this is actually quite a relevant part structurally of how the interests of disabled people are represented within government. This was formed in November 2019, and it brought together the Office for Disability Issues. In relation to Office for Disability Issues, that was within DWP,
Yep.
and that's when you were in your ministerial post, and then that became the disability unit and migrated over into the Cabinet Office.
Yep.
And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was the disability unit. And then by September 2020, if I understand your written evidence,
Yep.
it became part of the Equality Hub.
Yep.
Is that a fair summary?
Yes, it is.
And the Equality Hub, as an umbrella, covered the disability unit,
Yep.
the race disparity unit, and also the Government Equalities Office.
Yeah.
And there is, of course, a Minister for Equalities.
That's right.
And your role was to assist with that migration.
Yep.
Perhaps you may have not heard, but Lord Sedwill perhaps touched upon the rationale between why the disability unit was brought into existence and brought into the Cabinet Office. And see if you agree with this. The rationale was to bring some stability to coverage of those interests, to counterbalance ministerial change or churn, not his word. That's the context we've had. Perhaps you could tell me your understanding of.
So my understanding, my recollection is Cabinet Office is the eyes and ears of the machinery of government. And whilst I was based in DWP, any stakeholder engagement would invariably bring up issues that were beyond DWP's scope and responsibility. And it was more efficient from a Cabinet Office angle to then go and chase up the relevant departments to either flag the issue, seek resolution, etc. And so it was a move I was very supportive of. And then it sort of being part of the Equality Hub was also made sense because there was a lot of co-working, particularly around data and sharing that. So it made sense. It was a different building, so as a minister, it was the inconvenience of being spread across two, but I absolutely understood the decision behind that, and it was one I supported.
And in terms of your role, you had oversight of the disability unit. Did you have direct responsibility for the disability unit?
Yes, though it did sit within, ultimately within the Equality Hub, which was the responsibility of a different Secretary of State to my own. So I wouldn't have done the operational day-to-day things, but I would have, certainly in any stakeholder engagement, the disability unit would have been present, and they would have taken the responsibility of chasing that up with the relevant departments, relevant ministers. And I have to say they were an impressive unit who were very, very efficient at taking up any of the challenges and issues that were raised.
The last aspect of this part one of your evidence is with two hats on. You are now outside government.
Yep.
And with lessons learned or how we can improve things going forward, with that mindset, was there, do you think, at the time or looking back, a drawback that you were a minister, not a Minister of State, in the DWP and not a minister within the Cabinet Office?
And I think that's fair to dig into, because I've looked at many of the submissions that have come in and this has been raised. And it's a difficult, I can't give a definitive answer because there's advantages and disadvantages. Disability benefits is £13.6 billion at the time of COVID. It's greater now, 2.1 million people. And so for many people with disabilities and long-term health conditions, that would be the absolute priority for a minister, because if financial stability wasn't in place, the consequences could be catastrophic. But counter to that, Cabinet Office is better placed for cross-government work because it is the eyes and engines. So I can't give a definitive answer because there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Both can work, but having stepped out, I think probably a disability minister probably would be better placed in Cabinet Office. And I think the disability benefits can be run still from DWP as part of the wider benefits, but there would be some downside to that because there would be less focus.
So what we would have in this alternative structure would be a Minister for Equalities, which ideally would be somebody who's a Secretary of State, so at Cabinet Office level. And then underneath that, the Minister for Disabilities. And then with liaison between the Minister of Disabilities and the DWP to ensure the important financial support remains. Last point in terms of your involvement during the COVID response as a Minister of State, but not a Cabinet Secretary of State. It's right, isn't it, that you, on the whole, there is some exceptions which we'll turn to. You did not attend COBRA or Cabinet or the ministerial implementation groups or the COVID-O groups. As overall, that was the position.
Yeah, that's right.
There is exceptions, which we'll turn to. In terms of the interests of disabled people, how were they represented and raised at COBRA, at the relative MIG or COVID-O?
So there are a number of strands. So first of all, my Secretary of State, Therese Coffey, was exceptionally hardworking, took her role very seriously. So she was keen to attend COBRA as the senior member of the department. She would have daily meetings, so all ministers within DWP could flag issues. She was very receptive to issues being raised, which she would then take up if they needed to be. There were occasions where I attended where there were specific disability-related issues. And then the way that government works is the civil servants take those issues up, try to get them resolved, and generally, either if they have been resolved, they were flagged back to ministers, so we knew for future stakeholder engagement, or if there were issues, they would be brought back to ministers who could then either escalate them to other ministers who were responsible, and that would generally work. And again, I have to pay tribute that the civil servants, and I know there's been a lot of scrutiny around this, the civil servants always served me well in all of the roles, whether it was the disability unit or DWP, things were taken very seriously.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to part two, and we'll can touch upon the application of that in a little bit more detail. First heading is around the time of lockdown or the lead up to lockdown in March 2020. And you set out in your statement, we don't need to turn to it, that you were not directly involved in the UK government's initial strategy in the period from January to March 2020, including the decision to use lockdown. And that's correct, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we've heard already evidence regarding the shielding programme, which was set up at pace. And that was not something that you or the disability unit was involved in or had input in relation to?
Not that I recall.
No. In the narrative, I'd like to pick up and turn to a document, it's INQ 000187670. And this is a statement issued, a joint statement by you and other ministers on the 31st of March 2020. Perhaps if you could turn to page 2, please. That's the right page. And again, thank you. Turn over. Lovely, thank you. That may be a rogue reference, so we can take that off the screen. But it's touched upon in your statement at paragraph 71, a joint statement, late March 2020. And in that, it starts off with the following text, that the government hugely values disabled people and is committed to ensuring that disabled people are supported during this challenging and worrying time. It may chime with your recollection, and you've had a chance to see these documents beforehand. We will do everything in our power to ensure the needs of disabled people are addressed. It's with that words of reassurance, it reflects upon the legislation which had just been implemented, which had removed, and we're not going to go into the pros or cons today, but had removed certain safeguards in relation to disabled people. Do you recall that?
In what respect?
Well, in relation to the Coronavirus Act, there was certain provisions which had been lessened, safeguards which had been lessened because of the public emergency we were about to go experience.
Yeah, and I'm conscious we're not debating merits
Yes.
and demerits of things, but it was all about balance
Yes.
of limited resources in terms of workforce and making sure you prioritise the most vulnerable in society, because this was around social care easements, if I'm
That's
right.
correct. That's exactly, yes.
Not in my realm, but that was
No.
my recollection of that.
And it was a joint statement with you and the Permanent Under-Secretary of State for Children and Families. But the reassurance, which was the core message of this public statement, was that you were going to take decisive action to save as many lives as possible,
Yep.
and also ensure the highest levels of support for disabled people,
Yep.
their carers and their families
Yep.
during this challenging time.
Yep.
So that's the context we have.
Yep.
So that was the statement of intent.
Yep.
And if we can move on now, around that time, the Quality Hub and the Disability Unit were reacting to events as they emerged. And isn't it right, around that time, a decision was made to redeploy 51 members from the Disability Unit to assist with the overall response to the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, right across all of the areas I was responsible
Yes.
for, disability benefits, the vast majority of our frontline staff were from a medical background, so they were in huge numbers seconded to support the NHS, the vaccine rollout. Bearing in mind the benefits, the disability benefits system was predicated on frontline physical assessments, so
Yes.
that presented immediate challenges. But actually within the Equality Hub, a relatively small number compared to the other areas of the disability unit were seconded, and it certainly, from my recollection, didn't impact on our ability to carry out engagement and stakeholder work. What it will have done is perhaps some of the longer term work beyond COVID, once we return to normality, will have had to have been paused. But certainly for the immediate challenges of COVID, I didn't feel the disability unit were not in a position to serve out what they were.
That wasn't
able
your
to do.
experience.
It wasn't an issue.
And in fairness to you and the evidence we have elsewhere, there was a redeployment of staff initially, but
Yeah,
then
came back.
The disability unit were recategorised as essential
Yeah.
staff.
And certainly the cohort of staff who would join me to support in stakeholder engagement, they were certainly kept.
Yes. We're going to move on now to 21st of May 2020, and this is a paper which was prepared for the General Public Sector Ministerial Implementation Group, the MIG. And it's at INQ *0 83584, please. And this one works, which is helpful. And this was entitled The Impact of COVID-19 on Disabled People. If we could turn to page 3, please. So this is the documentation which was before the committee and there to assist you. And we see there that at page 3, findings, top left, further data on the impact of COVID-19 on disabled people will be key in guiding our response, e.g. health and employment. And in terms of, if we could scroll out, please, if that's okay. One of the actions is to start to build a data picture that measures are impacting disabled people disproportionately. So we see reference there is that there is a need for greater data.
Yeah.
What's the date of this?
This is May 2020, my lady.
Thank you.
And we see the far right as DHSC is exploring existing data sets to gain greater insights into health impacts and death, and extending the scope of a PHE review into the risk and outcomes of COVID-19 to cover disabled people, which we'll touch upon in a moment. At page 5 of this document, please. Findings, accessible communications is vital, something which is a feature of your statement. You recognise the need for impact assessments and to get further insight from lived experiences. And we see here, because engagement is another theme which we have in our evidence today and something within your statement. Feedback from stakeholders. Some disability groups have expressed concern about particular cohorts not being helped to the shielding programme, and that members are disadvantaged because the supermarkets are offering prioritised delivery slots for shielding individuals. That's the feedback, and we see the action there. A couple of questions in relation to that, because I know you touch upon how you were one of the individuals which, in your role, liaised with DEFRA to help this. Was there an issue around that time that those who were classified clinically extremely vulnerable, it omitted a significant amount of people who were also disabled and had significant vulnerabilities as well?
Is this in relation specifically to just in general?
In general, but also that was a difficulty, wasn't it? Was it not in relation to shielding? How there was support for those who were shielding, but also there was others who were not within the category of shielding and had been originally omitted.
So there was an absolute understanding across government that those with underlying health conditions and disabilities were the most likely to be impacted by COVID from a health perspective, the wider impacts of the changes in terms of lockdowns, etc. So cross-government was supportive of that principle. We were reminding people that the better quality data, the more accurate they can be. And as stakeholder engagement flagged issues, generally departments were very receptive to then take that up and then adjust. At no point were things like the lists, the prioritisation lists, ever set in stone and will never be moved. They were always evolving. I certainly recall when we first saw sight of the vaccination priority list, the DHSC were very keen to take areas that may have been missed from their initial assumptions and work with the stakeholder groups that we had already met with, and we could then signpost to the relevant people. In fact, in that case, Minister Zahawi actually met with the Disability Charities Consortium, and they are predominantly the leading health and disability charities with many millions reach of members.
Well, that may be an opportunity to deal with the topic of engagement. And you mentioned in your statement that this was, in your view, an important part of your role, and that the disability unit worked within government and with disabled people and organisations and charities, to use your words, to gain insight and encourage engagement with the government. And you set out 4 categories of stakeholders, which I'm going to summarise and then give you the opportunity.
Can I just add one quick thing there? The disability unit would flag 3 things. 1, issues that had been raised through their meetings, stakeholder engagement, including with myself. Secondly, where they offered solutions themselves and could therefore help speed up the response. An example I set out in my written statement was the DEFRA's access to food, for which a number of the members of the Disability Charity Consortium actually joined the task force, and they were able to utilise what they were getting on their telephone and online forums from their members and give that valuable insight that sped up the ability for them to come up with a response. And thirdly, to test out things because of their extra knowledge. And finally, to then utilise their communications, because not everybody was tuning in at the 6 o'clock daily news briefings. And many of these organisations had reach to groups of people who otherwise wouldn't have been getting the government messages, and they were seen as trusted sources.
Well, I'm going to take this even more shortly in relation to engagement, because it's set out in your statement the 4 different categories and organisations which you and the disability unit engaged with during that period of time. In terms of the evaluation of that, first of all, did you, in your view, find that level of engagement to be beneficial and feed through into decision making?
Hugely. Every minister is different about how they conduct themselves. I've always enjoyed stakeholder engagement. I've found it makes for better policy development. It provides you with insight that even the most academic policymakers, unless they've got that lived experience, would not necessarily appreciate. They road test things. There is nothing worse for a minister than spending 18 months developing what ultimately becomes legislation for somebody to then point out something that should have been noticed at the beginning, and therefore you've wasted 18 months. And in the case as I gave with the Access to Food Task Force, it speeds up the process because they bring that extra level of expertise. Now, not all stakeholders agree. Many stakeholders are critical. And ultimately, as the Minister, you have to make a judgment. That's why you're in that role. And not all stakeholders will agree with that. But I think it makes for better policy development. And it's something that I passionately wanted to see, not just for myself as a Minister, but to be embedded as a given across government. And again, you look at all of the instances where I'm on cross-government things, I'm always pushing for better data because you more accurate decisions, pushing for that engagement, because why would you not want to have that insight, that level of challenge, that level of ideas? So it's something that I was very passionate about, and separately that then linked through to the theme of the National Disability Strategy.
Which we'll loop back towards at the end. So in relation, obviously a passion and a value placed on engagement and wish for that to be successful. Looking back now, do you consider that there was any deficiencies or areas for improvement with that engagement in terms of including other people, or was it more reactive than proactive?
There are always challenges. There is, as a Minister, there is one of you, and I genuinely think it'd be hard-pressed to find a Minister who probably did more stakeholder meetings. But there are thousands and thousands of disability charities, organisations, individuals, welfare advisors, and also staff on the front line. They often have very valuable insight to be shared. I can't, as an individual minister, be everywhere all of the time because you also have your parliamentary business. And so we were always trying to evolve how we could meet with a diverse range. When I first became a minister, it's fair to say, this is in my first time as a junior minister, predominantly London-based organisations would get the lion's share because they could logistically come in to Westminster. And so that was the thinking behind the regional stakeholder network that we set up, because that gave an opportunity for organisations in all corners of the United Kingdom, particularly through Teams and Zoom meetings, to be able to then feed in. And you wanted to just try and get a very, very good mix. There are never enough hours in the day to meet everybody, and some stakeholders are better than others at utilising the time that they have. And where we could see particularly good insight, particularly good suggestions, we then, through the disability unit, would then flag that up to the ministers and say, these are people who can help you be better departments, better design policy, and policy that will stand the test of time.
Thank you. So we were on the 21st of May at this meeting, and we looked at documents. I'm not going to invite you to turn to the minutes of the meeting, but I can summarise the minutes of that meeting once we've already seen the supporting documentation. And one of the minutes was that all departments support you, the Minister for Disabled People, and the Disability Unit to ensure that their communications are fully accessible. And secondly, all departments to consider data gaps on the impact of COVID-19 on disabled people. So the need for more data recognised from that. And I'd like us to move on now in the timeline, please, to the summer of 2020. And in relation to the Office of National Statistics, ONS, you refer to the work they were doing in your statement. We don't need to turn to that, but you were not directly involved with the disability unit's engagement with ONS during the summer.
No, that's operational.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about how cited you were on that work at that time, and maybe operational, but obviously you might need to know the data and how that may impact policy. How cited were you as to data from ONS and how it impacted on disabled people?
So that would have been part of so I would regularly meet with my officials, whether that's within DWP or the disability unit, and themes were discussed. It was a given, not just for myself, but everybody across government, that those with disabilities or long-term health conditions or any underlying health conditions would be at greater risk of the impacts of COVID. Whilst the data, we were seeking better quality data to evidence-base that was the working assumption across government. I do not recall a single meeting where somebody pushed back and said, I think you're asking too much because of that. That was a presumption that was a given. It is always helpful to have more data as quick as possible. That's what the ONS do, and we supported calls, and we reminded government colleagues to use that as evidence-based, particularly when you're lobbying Treasury for extra money. Lesson number one is have evidence to support your bid.
So we had the meeting in May, the need for greater data, something as a working assumption. You were mindful of the adverse impacts the pandemic would have on disabled people. And we know that on the 19th of June, ONS released data which, in broad terms, was an indicator of greater incidence of death in both male and female disability groups.
Yep.
And it says, set out in very short term, that the causes are still being identified.
Yep.
So there was a degree of uncertainty
Yep.
at that stage.
Yep.
Let's move on in the timeline now, please, to the 24th of September 2020, and there's a COVID-0 meeting. And in relation to that, we could perhaps turn to one of the papers which has been prepared. That's INQ quadruple 4, and I think it's right in front of us, thank you, 90046. And this is a paper in relation to disproportionately impacted groups. And that was presented at this COVID-0 meeting. And we see the first part, and I anticipate we will see this again. So I'm going to deal with that material shortly, but not wishing to minimise its importance. It sets out the significant impact on BAME groups in relation to COVID, and includes older people and disabled people there. And it talks about that these are communities at increased risk.
Yeah.
And it refers to urgent action is needed to prevent the same issues being replicated, that we are facing a second wave of infections. And that bold is not by us, that was within the document itself. So clearly, urgent, pressing, and the need for more information. And it says at number 2, please, thank you, on the same page, the recommendations in this paper would augment, actually it's page 2, not paragraph 2. Thank you so much. If you could turn over a leaf. The recommendations in this paper would augment and complement the work led by the Ministers for Equalities in relation to COVID-19 disparities for BAME groups, commissioned following the PHE report published in early June, and address issues outside the remit of that work. You'll recall the PHE report that there was reference to that in our document we saw back in May. I want to ask you this. We know that Ms. Badenoch was doing work in relation to the impact in terms of ethnic minorities, and that that was prompted by a PHE report in June, and we've heard evidence that was updated in August 2020. Was it the case that, as identified here, that disabled people generally, which of course would include those who are within ethnic minority groups, but was it a case that disabled people were outside that work which has been done by the Minister for Equalities at that stage?
No, I mean, this was predominantly looking around the lower take-up of vaccinations within certain cohorts of society.
Just pausing there, because I don't want you to go on us to be at cross purposes. This is September 2020. We're not really in vaccine territory.
Sorry. In terms of the messaging getting out, my apologies, and so this ultimately led on to identifying that the initial 6 o'clock briefings were not necessarily reaching as effectively certain cohorts of society, and this would then ultimately look at more bespoke ways through community leaders, different ways of communicating, and from a disability-specific perspective, it was an opportunity for me to remind colleagues that, particularly through the DCC, the Disability Charities Consortium, their reach to their membership was many millions, and actually we should be utilising across government that reach to get specific messages to different groups.
Was it the case that the work stream for disabled people and finding out more information, more data, was in fact falling behind the work which was ongoing in relation to the adverse impacts on ethnic minority groups?
So my recollection that it was the other way round, because that was already embedded into the thinking of DHSC. As I said, I don't recall ever having a meeting where people pushed back on the assumption that those with underlying health conditions or disabilities were at greater risk of the impact of COVID.
This is where we have your working assumption, which I'm not sure.
When I say we, the government,
Yes.
societies,
Of course.
that was never in question as far as I'm aware.
Just to finish the question, the working assumption you referred to, but was it a case that there was a lack of further data to assist policy makers address the needs of disabled people at that stage in September 2020?
I don't recall a specific in that.
It's hard. Let's work through the documents.
I absolutely accept the point that you would always want the very best possible data. Data takes time to collect, so I'm not saying we had magical, all-encompassing data at our disposal, but the fact we didn't, in my mind, lower the urgency that society and government, cross-government, understood around the areas of disability and health conditions.
We've got 4 more date points where we're going to touch upon. I'm going to do those briefly, but if we go to the minutes of this meeting, which is INQ *0090183, this is we see. I understand. I think you're present at that meeting. We can see your name there, Mr. Tomlinson, on page 1. And the stark toll of COVID was highlighted at that meeting. If we turn to page 5, please. And we can see that at the second paragraph, there's reference to use the phraseology here, a BAME person was still more likely to die from coronavirus. It sets that out there. Come back out, please. Just scope out, thank you. Further down the third paragraph, it says this: 60% of those who had died from coronavirus identified as disabled. And even once accounting for other risk factors, disabled people were 1.6 times more likely to die from coronavirus. Individuals were 70 times more likely to die if over the age of 80 compared to those under the age of 40. And men were twice as likely to die from coronavirus compared to women. So breathtaking numbers, but how disabled people, that large cohort, was being disproportionately impacted by coronavirus. And that's something that you were aware of and it was influencing your work.
Because I don't profess to be a medical expert, but if you have an underlying health condition, you are more likely to suffer the impacts of COVID. And that's seen with age, and the prevalence of disability and health conditions increases with age.
If we turn to the 12th of November 2020, and this is where there was more work being done ahead of the next COVID-0 discussion on this topic. And if we could turn to INQ *0083918, please. It sets out the context of the meeting on the 27th of November, the recommendations we see, data commission to understand factors driving increased mortality risk. Engagement is touched upon, a National Centre for Digital Access to assist and make things more accessible as well. If we turn to page 2, please. And we see in the box, available data and an analysis on the question of disproportionate impacts of COVID on disabled people has significant gaps. ONS data on social impact of COVID is broken down by impairment. The current mortality data does not tell us what types of disabilities, impairments are associated with an increased risk of death from COVID-19. And it says, at the bottom of that paragraph, we are currently not clear what is driving the increased risk. And it says this, is that these gaps mean we have insufficient information to inform COVID-19 policy making for people with disabilities. And if this is not addressed at pace, HMG faces a wider reputation risk of being too slow to act in spite of several credible reports of significant differential impacts. You can see that being the third bottom bullet points. So in this paper, real concerns been expressed within government regarding these significant gaps and talking about reputational harm. But of course, as you would say, the interests of disabled people are paramount. What was the concern at that stage, and what was being done by government in relation to trying to get more data to address this?
So everybody accepted that better quality data allowed better quality of targeting. Now, whether that is the prioritisation of services, access to vaccinations, from a DWP perspective, at the very beginning, to make sure that financial stability was in place. There was an extra £500 million injected into the welfare system with improved data. Were all the right people being targeted? Would you have chosen smaller cohorts but offered them more of that money? And that's what was underlying that. The balance to that is, in the absence of absolute accurate data, there was a working assumption that those with underlying health conditions and disabilities absolutely would need that. And as time went on and data caught up, that provided more evidence to give more targeted support going forward.
The big question is, was the government fast enough in commissioning that data, in seeking out that data for disabled people? Or were they being forgotten, or their interests not as progressed as other groups?
As it's not me who commissions the data, I can't give you an absolute answer. But what I can say, in the absence of where absolute, accurate, perfect, gold-plated data existed, it did not hold me back as a minister pushing for our share of additional support, additional prioritisation, because there was that working assumption. And I've repeated this several times because I've also been a minister when it hasn't been COVID, and I've gone with what I think are perfectly robust and very good, positive, tangible asks to government, Treasury, and have been turned away because I don't have the evidence to back up my assumption. In terms of asking for things, there was a very big difference between during the challenges of COVID for our asks and outside of COVID.
This is in the lead up to a meeting on the 8th of December 2020, a Covid-0 meeting, and you were present at that. And I'm going to summarise it. We don't need to turn to the documents, but it mirrors what we've seen, concerns regarding data and mortality for understandable reasons, one could see in relation to that. And it touches upon also the indirect impacts of COVID as well, in terms of financial and mental health, which was seen as another impact on disabled people. And does that accord with your understanding and your engagement that those were the indirect impacts as well?
Yes, absolutely.
In terms of the recommendations, and as we, at this stage in our timeline, we've left lockdown 2. We are accelerating towards Christmas.
Yep.
And we have lockdown 3, as we now know, on the horizon.
Yep.
And the recommendation at Covid-0 is more data,
Yep.
more testing, and to help disabled people's access to use digital technology. A concern that a significant amount of disabled people were isolated and needed to be included. In relation to that may be an opportunity to very briefly deal with communications.
Yeah.
A lot's in your statement regarding accessibility. And you say this, that the Equality Hub and the Disability Unit worked to support Cabinet Office communications, to use your phraseology, stakeholder knowledge, to improve government communications. And you give an example about the British Sign Language, BSL interpreter, for daily press conferences. And in your statement at paragraph 67A, you recall that the product of this engagement was, it was flagged to you that the British government, I think it probably would be the UK government, I'm citing your statement, and daily press conferences did not have the benefit of a BSL interpreter, whereas the Scottish press conference did. And what did you do when that was raised with you?
This was hugely frustrating. So I've highlighted many areas where the cross-government flagging of issues, quick resolutions, positive outcomes. This was on the other end of the spectrum. This was right from the beginning of the stakeholder engagement. This was one of the first issues that was flagged. It was flagged repeatedly, not just by organisations like RNIB, though they would understandably, it was a key issue there, but the wider stakeholder, it was very topical. It was in the national news, in parliamentary questions, in debates. This was being issued. And for me, sometimes when you're given an ask, you know they're going to be difficult. They come with a big financial cost. They're complex cross-government. This was one of those which was an easy fix, and it took far too long. And I, to this day, still do not understand why we couldn't have resolved that much quicker. It was done in the devolved areas. And also, eventually, Lord Bethell sent a reply, I believe it was to RNIB, I believe.
There was correspondence.
And he, in effect, said for social distancing reasons. But I get that, but it could have been done in another room and then been done, which it was ultimately done for the online and the feeds that were provided to other news channels. It was one of those, it could and should have been better. No doubt about it. And for me, hugely frustrating, because in that stakeholder engagement, you've got limited time, and it was one we didn't need to have to keep going over because it should have just been fixed as a given. Absolutely.
So, drawing it together, the starting point, there wasn't a BSL signer at the outset at the press conferences, which were a very important mode of communication.
Yep.
After it was raised with you, it wasn't raised within government, it was raised by you that there wasn't a BSL interpreter. The solution was a sort of hybrid where a BSL interpreter was on BBC News rather than on the main BBC channel at 6 o'clock, for example.
Should have been quicker and should have been an easy fix.
And the frustration which was conveyed to you was it felt that the needs of disabled people were not considered or were an afterthought. Was that something that was conveyed to you?
On that specific area, there was a frustration, and believe me, I shared it.
Second point and last point in relation to communications, you had engagement with the Royal National Institute for Blind People in relation to problems as to accessibility of shielding letters and information. And they raised that with you and government in April 2020. That resulted in revised guidance, and it says that it led to some improvements. I think a qualified recognition that there was an improvement. Is that?
Yeah, and look, they were fantastic. Government, at times, some of the communication that went out wasn't fully accessible. And organisations like RNIB and many of the others, predominantly in the Disability Charities Consortium, have fantastic policy teams, expertise, because day to day they're communicating with their own members in a format that is accessible to their members. And it was doubly frustrating because I would raise this at meetings and say, please make sure your communications are accessible. Nobody ever said, no, Minister, we want to deliberately make them unaccessible. Nobody got up in the morning to deliberately do that. But they don't necessarily have either the expertise and they were working at speed. And so we pushed, first of all, to raise awareness. We offered the stakeholders as experts, let them check it over before it goes out, look at their guidelines. And ultimately, we managed to get a senior person inside the Cabinet Office to own this as an issue, who was well regarded by the wider stakeholders. She'd been Chief Executive of a member of the Disability Charity Consortium. And that formed the Rapid Accessibility Contact Team, because again, there's a balance between the urgency to get information out, and you don't want a 6-week lead time to check it's the exact font size and things like that. But I wanted to make sure that that would be a given, not just during COVID, but forevermore, because to me, it is an area that should be a given. And again, not as much as the BSL, but it was up there in frustrations of relatively easy things to fix that we could and should have done better.
Okay. 2 more areas I'd like your assistance upon. We're going to be about 5 minutes, and then there's going to be questions from core participants to you. We were, in this second part, dealing with the timeline, working through the need for data. We've gone through from May to summer, to September, November, December. And we have the publication of the cross-government Covid-19 disability measures, which takes place on the 28th of January 2021. It's touched upon in your statement at paragraph 61, but perhaps we could turn to the document itself. It's INQ quadruple 083896. And this is a document which is there, which reference to publishing a package of cross-government measures. So INQ quadruple 083896. Thank you. So it's addressed to you. We see the dates, which I've read already, and it wants a decision by the 3rd of February, which would allow us, you, to publish in advance of the next updated estimates of COVID-19 related deaths by disability status on the 11th of February. That's referring to the ONS data, which took place in February 2020. If we just scroll down a little bit more and we can see paragraph 2. And this is a good way to convey the concerns expressed externally, but recognised internally within the note from your department to you. Mm-hmm. There's growing stakeholder-driven narrative that disabled people are being forgotten and left behind throughout the pandemic. And it cites a letter to a number of ministers from Scope, a national organisation, in January 2020. How they've work shows that disabled people have routinely told us they have felt forgotten during the pandemic. And it talks about and refers to how a significant amount of disabled people have died of COVID. Mm-hmm. If we scroll out a bit, please, thank you. And it says later on in that document, is this feeds into media criticism, such as the Won't Be Forgotten campaign, which states 1 in 4 disabled people feel forgotten by the government, and Census, another national organisation, Forgotten Families campaign, which highlights the difficulties for families with children with complex needs. Talking a lot here, just trying to draw out the recognition within the party, within the government, of the concerns regarding this. And if we move on, please, to paragraph 11, further down in that document, please. And in suggesting the recommendations, it recognises the current media and stakeholder landscape on disability. And there's been a strong narrative from stakeholders echoed by the media that people feel left behind. Mm-hmm. If we could turn over a leaf, please. And it says there that there's concern about this is too little, too late. We can see in the 3rd line. If ministers do decide to announce, there may be some criticism in some quarters for doing too little, too late. In relation to that suggestion in the paper, were you mindful that there was concerns externally from national disability organisations and from other stakeholder engagements that disabled people felt left behind, and what was done and what was done was too little, too late?
So in part, through the regular stakeholder engagement, issues were flagged. Some were relatively straightforward to resolve. Some shaped responses both during COVID and beyond COVID, and there were outstanding issues. And there it highlights the impact of that slowness to have the BSL interpreters as a given as part of the daily conference. And the impact of that was greater than just the people that it was directly impacting on. And it was useful at all cross-government meetings for me to then remind ministers that wouldn't necessarily deal with disability issues on a day-to-day basis, that there were cohorts of the people that they would be impacting, and that there was a resource predominantly from that Disability Charities Consortium Scope being highlighted. Fantastic policy team, fully engaged chief executive. I met with them time and time again at different levels, so did our policy teams, and we were advocating their use. So if you were the children's minister, that they could bring that extra level of expertise beyond your own department's policy team, who wouldn't necessarily appreciate the knock-on impacts of wider decisions that were taken. And finally, to utilise their comms network of their own, so that they could present changes, particularly where there's additional support, particularly where there's opportunities to be prioritised, etc., through their network, to make sure those messages reached. Because it is clear in a 6 o'clock briefing, you can't fit everything in. And utilising those individual organisations to get very bespoke messages would then help to turn that dial on the underlying point that some people felt that they had been forgotten.
The final data point is, we know in February 21 the ONS data was announced, and we'll touch upon it in a moment, but significant higher rate of mortality for disabled people. And it really goes back to the final point on this is, were you satisfied, looking back now and recognising the best efforts you and your colleagues and civil services were trying to do, was there sufficient visibility and insight about the impact of COVID on disabled people during the pandemic, in your view?
In most areas, my role, if you speak to the majority of disability stakeholders, the focus is invariably around disability benefits. At the time, £13.6 billion. The logistical challenges to keep that system open, and we did that through automatic extension, so anybody who was at risk of coming off the benefit were automatically extended, providing financial stability, leaving our very finite resources to focus on new claimants, so nobody was left out, and claimants whose health condition had deteriorated so would be entitled to a higher level of financial support. And bearing in mind that this was a system predicated on physical assessments where people had to travel to a physical assessment, to bring forward initially telephone assessments and then video assessments. And that was the stakeholder network were absolutely fantastic in giving me fast information about whether that was working, whether we were missing people, whether there were issues. And then ultimately, they then wanted it to become a permanent feature, which it did beyond COVID. And those areas, had they gone wrong, would have been absolutely catastrophic. The same as if universal credit had tripped over. These were systems that took a significant chunk of our focus because the implications were unthinkable.
Just pausing there.
Yep.
And I need to break it up and give our stenographer a brief rest. So in terms of your answer, you said in most places there was visibility, and you emphasised the importance of financial support.
Yes.
And that was one of the indirect impacts, which was identified at a COVID-0 meeting.
Yep.
Visibility in most parts. Where did you, looking back now, with a view to lessons learned, where was there a lack of visibility?
So the two areas around accessible communications, because for many departments, a focus on disability would be a relatively small part of their bigger packages, which was why we then pushed so hard that they utilised, particularly the Disability Charities Consortium, their policy teams, their research, their live updates, feedback from their members, to make sure there weren't groups missed, things weren't designed well, and to make sure that communications were accessible. Because, as I said, that was personally frustrating, because if I'm doing questions in the House, if I'm appearing at select committees, stakeholder meetings, you don't want to have to deal with things that should just be a given. You don't want to do it.
Going to follow through on my promise to give you the final opportunity to add, to assist Her Ladyship in terms of lessons learned. Do you consider that there's a additional matter you want to mention, which you consider is an area for recommendations, or where the inquiry can learn lessons?
Despite all of the challenges, there were benefits that came out in terms of, particularly around engagement, that ability for us to set up a regional stakeholder network to get voices that weren't just London. There's nothing against people from London, but perhaps issues that are faced in the North East or Wales can sometimes be different, does genuinely make for better insight, speed up policy development, improve policy. And it was a message that I want government, of which I'm no longer a minister, I want the new versions of me to take as a given, to see it as an opportunity to be better ministers, to be a better government and produce better policies. And we saw that with the National Disability Strategy. We saw that with the Health and Disability Green Paper that was running alongside throughout COVID, and in the stakeholder meetings we would invariably cover all three topics. And also to never be precious about the agendas. It was very much, if I met with the stakeholder group, it was for them to choose how they wanted to use that time. And many of the stakeholder groups would clearly put a lot of thought in, utilise that team very well, particularly around their offers of, we have an expertise in that area, disability employment, for example. We can help you co-design something that will be much better. And ministers need to be receptive of that. That's why I enjoyed it, because it benefited myself as a minister and the wider government. People accepted that during COVID, and I hope that isn't being lost as we've returned to normality.
Thank you. They're all my questions, my lady.
Right.
My lady's given permission.
Yes, I have, and I think Mr. Freedman and Ms. Davis have moved so you don't get a stiff neck. Mr. Freedman's going to ask some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tomlinson. I'm asking questions for 4 national disabled people's organisations. Can we start with the outset of the pandemic, please? You've told the chair that neither you or the disability unit were involved in decision-making, including around the shielding programme from January to March. So at the outset of the pandemic, did you establish personally whether there was an existing emergency plan for disabled people?
Not that I recall.
Did there come a time when you realised, what I think we know from the evidence, that there was none?
Not that I recall.
We've heard about the public statement that was made by you and colleagues on the 31st of March. Just for references, at paragraph 79 of your statement, we don't need to go there. I think the correct reference for the record is INQ 3018764. But the essence of that was to provide reassurance to disabled people and perhaps others that were caring for them, that notwithstanding the easements and the like in the Care Act that had been brought in as a result of the coronavirus legislation, that ministers were poised to protect disabled people. That's the essence of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
On that basis, and following on from some questioning of Lord Sedwell, why did it take until the 21st of May 2020 for a ministerial implementation group meeting, in this case the General Public Sector one, to have the impact of COVID-19 on disabled people as an agenda item?
Because that is not the only work in isolation. So, for example, disability benefits, which are in the early evidence I've given, that was done straight away, with 2.1 million people relying on either DLA, the legacy benefit, or personal independence, £13.6 billion worth of expenditure. That was done immediately alongside the changes to universal credit, the changes to access to work, the changes to access to carers allowance, with the many millions of carers in this country, changing the easements. So these sorts of meetings are flagging then topical issues, outstanding issues of the time, rather than an opportunity to list things that are already in train as a given. And there were many areas across government where that was the place. Things come forward in these meetings, and then it's decided which is the relevant minister to represent their respective departments.
Well, I'm not going to go back on the evidence that you've given quite thoroughly about a satisfactory element is how everybody stood up, including you in your core job in at least the Department of Work and Pensions and others around you to deal with benefits. And we've heard your evidence about that. But broadly speaking, if there was a working assumption that everybody in government would know that disabled people would be at risk of both the virus itself, but also the provisions brought in response to the virus, was it too late for the key ministerial implementation group meeting to be looking at the impact on disabled people, to wait until the 21st of May?
No, I don't accept that, because you're working on the assumption nothing was done until that point. As issues are raised, issues are fed in at speed. The whole process in responding was all done at speed across government. It is wrong to say nothing happens until a particular meeting. A meeting is a point in time where things are recorded, but issues, and I gave the DWP examples around the disability benefits because I don't want to give you 3 hours worth of evidence. Things happened before that and they were done at pace. That doesn't mean everything happened, which is why you have these meetings to hold different departments to account, to formally put in writing agreed actions and an opportunity to challenge other departments to up their game.
Well, let's look quickly at that May document again and one last page of it. It's 83584. At page 7. Okay. Bottom of page 7. Is it up? Is it up? Sorry, we're just waiting. INQ 83. Yes. Just at the bottom of page 7. Next steps so that each department develops a plan for addressing key evidence gaps and agrees to meet the disability unit to discuss these plans for a further meeting in about 6 weeks. We've been through the rest of that document with the chair. This is in May 2020. Is this fair? This also is not a plan being presented to this ministerial group. It's essentially a situational summary. I'm taking the whole document that we went through. And at its height, it's a plan to talk to departments about a plan to address key evidence gaps, and in about 6 weeks.
No, I don't accept that.
No?
That's 6 weeks you report back, but that doesn't mean you agree an idea you want to do and then you sit on it for 6 weeks. Action starts straight away.
No, I'm not asking you about what you're doing. I'm asking you about a plan.
Right.
And
Same thing.
First of all, are we right? We shouldn't take this document of May 2020 as a whole and suggest this is a plan. We can use different words, but it's essentially a means to give this ministerial group meeting situational awareness. We've been through it already with Mr. Keating. And then it ends by saying that in about 6 weeks, we'll come back, and in the meantime, we'll get to departments to plan to address key gaps.
I don't accept that. That's a report back, but issues would have been covered in other meetings in between where they were particularly prevalent at the time. That's just not how government works.
Right.
Okay.
Can I look, please, with you briefly at your contribution to the Ministerial Implementation Group on the 21st of May 2020? The reference is INQ 83626. This is the note of the meeting. And can we go to page 5, please? Where we see in the bottom section what should be the summary of your part in the meeting. Can I just draw out some aspects of what is recorded there? Engagement with stakeholders suggests that there is a positive view of the COVID-19 response, especially the pace at which new initiatives have been put in place. However, this work has highlighted a lack of data across government on disability issues, an example being the DEFRA food supply work, which is subject to data lag. The Minister affirmed that COVID response presents both risks and opportunities for disabled people. Some changes that would have taken years to implement in normal times have been made possible very quickly. In terms of next steps, the Minister said more work was needed from departments to go further on evidence and that the disability unit will be in touch about this. Mrs. Thompson, our questions are along these lines. Given at the outset of the pandemic there was no plan in the sense of a coherent plan for disabled people, is this too sanguine a picture, at least in the way in which it's summarised this committee? Because what is not said there is we have no comprehensive plan. We have been delayed in getting one. Whatever actions and successes we may have had, we absolutely need to have a coherent plan and a package of measures now.
But again, you're working on the assumption that nothing has happened at this point. So many things were able to be done at pace at the beginning. again, going back to the changes to the disability benefits, changes to access to work, changes to access to the carer's allowance. But it's then putting into place the work beyond this point. Nobody disagrees that's cross-government. That's departments that are maybe not used to having to think of wider or more bespoke cohorts of people that they want to support. That's the reason behind highlighting around the risks and opportunities, how some of the emergency changes that we would have made during COVID, actually through stakeholder feedback, it becomes clear that they're welcome changes, and actually once we return to normality, let's keep those in place. Again, a good example of that, it was almost unheard of work from home. That obviously came through in COVID, and that then opened the door to a new cohort of people who previously not had a realistic expectation of being able to work. This from a disability employment perspective, and we then wanted to then explore whether we would need to legislate to protect that going forward. But as it turned out, in most cases, employers saw that as a beneficial, and it stayed in place. And
sorry, I just want to interrupt because you're talking about actions. I want to just make it clear: is there a cross-government plan for disabled people in relation to the pandemic as of this time? We're in 21st of May 2020. Plan, not set of actions.
Well, it's included in all of the wider government actions.
Right. Can we then go forward to October of November in 2020? And we've already gone through the chronology. The ONS has gone through its summer work. And then there's been that meeting in September that we looked at with Mr. Keating with that breathtaking numbers of the 60% fatalities. Can you look at the briefing for a meeting entitled Disproportionate Impacts of COVID on Disabled People prepared by the DU for you, and it's dated the 30th of October. It's INQ 83956. Just on page 1, looking at paragraphs 3 and 4, the purpose is to discuss one, data HMB has on disability, and then to 2, consider interventions that HMG could seek to implement cross-government tackle the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 has on disabled peoples. And this follows, this is paragraph 4, a steer from the Prime Minister for much greater ambition from this work and subsequent commissions from Emma and Mian, Chair knows about him, from the COVID task force, and a letter from the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and there in the annexes A and B. Can we go to Annex B and Mr. Gobe's letter? This is page 8, and this is in the briefing to you. Now, second paragraph, it says, it will not now be possible to announce an ambitious package of interventions in the Minister of Equality's oral statement scheduled for next week, in which she will announce publication of her first quarterly report on disparities. That's the work. That's a reference to the work that Minister Badenoch were doing. And then it says, this is a terrible missed opportunity, in Mr. Gobe's view. Just down the bottom of the page, still page 8, internal page 7, there's the reference to the 59.2% of those who have died from COVID as being disabled. Cross to the page 9, just after the bullet points on disproportionate impacts, there's a reference to time is running out to mitigate risk for these groups in the second wave. And then last main paragraph, in addition to his headline ask for more ambition, I think that's the Prime Minister, I want you to draw your attention to his request to departments to consider options for improving outcomes for those with disabilities ahead of a future COVID-0 discussion. This is also extremely important work. I expect Secretaries of State to work with their departments to bring much more ambition and far-reaching proposals to the discussion as per the Prime Minister's steer. Is it right that, in spite of that very strong steer attributed to the Prime Minister, in effect, we have a situation where we're now not 6 weeks on from May 2021. We're several months on from May 2021. 2020, I apologise. We're not 6 weeks on from May 2020. We're several months on from May 2020. There's been the very important issues arising for Black, Asian and ethnic minority workers. Minister Badenoch and Public Health England has talked about. And here we have in this briefing to you, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Prime Minister, and sort of criticism obviously of you, we're looking at the system saying we just need a far more ambitious package in relation to disabled people. Is that the best way to read what is being asked for by those two key figures as of this date, 30th of October?
Well, I see it differently. I see it that the then Prime Minister, took this area very seriously, and as a minister who worked cross-government, having the Prime Minister's interest was a very powerful way to encourage other departments to act at pace and take it seriously. That underpinned the whole of the National Disability Strategy, that went alongside during COVID, in the sense that that really does focus other departments' minds. I found that a helpful statement. And it goes back to my earlier answer, that you misunderstand how governments work. It isn't a case that you have a meeting, you discuss things and do nothing until the next meeting. It is a point in time, and work was always ongoing. And I found different government departments receptive to do things where they could, with exceptions, for example, the frustration over accessible communications, the BSL, and other things that I will have highlighted in my evidence statement. So you and I...
We are disagreeing. That's fine, but let's take it further forward. The senior figures in government asked for a more ambitious package. Let's go to the 5th of November 2020, INQ 40-83917. This is at the top of it, page 1. Disproportionately impacted groups, focus on disabled people, 27th of November. It is from Emran Mir, who we know about, 5th of November. We see the subject. It's copied to, amongst others, HMT, you as the Minister for Disabled People, Sarah Baker, who leads in disability unit matters on this, Marcus Bell, Mr Gove himself, and Principal Secretaries to Number 10 and Cabinet Office. I just want to show you the section on page 2, under the words context. At the 29th of November meeting of COVID-0, the committee agreed to an ambitious package of measures to prevent transmission to and within groups that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, focusing in particular on ethnic minority communities. The Prime Minister and Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster also asked departments in slower time for a more ambitious package that can prevent disproportionate impacts from COVID-19 for people with disabilities. I'm not asking about actions. I'm asking for a plan to produce a broad, coherent, cross-government package. Notwithstanding the terrible data about Black and Asian ethnic minority deaths required, what is meant here by delayed planning for disabled people for a more ambitious package to work on slower time?
So you've got two things. You've got the here and now, the immediate decisions that need to be taken, whether within our direct control or cross-government, and then the wider things, for example, again using DWP as an example, where we've introduced telephone and video assessments as an emergency measure to look at whether that could then become a permanent feature, the changes to statutory sick pay, the information given to employers around working from home, the changes we've made to access to the carers allowance, are these features that we can then at a later date announce as ongoing permanent features? Because that goes back to my earlier point, or the earlier point that was raised around risks and opportunities, because there were telephone and video assessments were a part of the Health and Disability Green Paper with a realistic timeline of probably 5 to 10 years before it could have been implemented. We had to do them as part of the emergency response to COVID. That was happening, and that would continue to happen during COVID. But then at a separate pace, there was then the discussion, well, actually, this seems to be well received by stakeholders. Should this now remain a permanent feature? And in some of those cases, that was easy to do because their operation carry them on. Others, we would then need to bring legislation forward. And you saw post-COVID, as we returned to normality, there was various tidying up pieces of legislation that turned emergency government actions into permanent features, and then a lot of this would have been shaped by...
Mr. Tomlinson...
Hang on. A lot of this would have been shaped by the wonderful work of the various stakeholders who worked with us to give insight.
Mr. Tomlinson, I'm asking you questions about what happened with the ambitious...
Many more, I'm afraid, Mr. Freeman. I'm afraid you're running out of time.
No, I understand.
I've also
understand.
got problems with stenographers.
I understand. Let me then take you to the 12th of November 2020. I'm asking about the ambitious package that was called for. This is back to 83918. 83918. This was, I'll take it quickly, at paragraph 3, the package suggested. 3.1, data commission to understand factors driving increased mortality. A national panel of disabled people to formally structure the point, and a national centre for digital access. Now, is it right to take it quickly? 3.1 was not an actual organisation, it was to commission better data. How did you understand 3.1?
Yeah, fine.
Pardon?
Yes.
Yes. Is it right that 3.2 and 3.3, for whatever reason, did not go through?
So 3.2 ultimately went beyond my time as the minister. When I was going through all the evidence packs, it's a question I have outstanding. I'm interested to know what did happen with that, so I can't.
I think you could take it from me that it
Fine.
didn't.
And then thirdly, the National Centre for Digital Access. My recollection was that did not offer an immediate assistance and therefore would be part of normal departmental bidding for normal business. But again, you are taking these things, this very narrow area in isolation, ignoring the wider work. For example, the continuation of the £500 million cash injection into the welfare system, that in itself would be a big announcement, but it was a given because we understood the urgency of doing it and did it at the start. You're taking things in a very narrow and not quite following how governments work.
Well, you've said it to me several times and you've told me about what the DWP did, but let me finish with this. The Badenoch investigation on disparities. First of all, what is your answer in terms of your understanding in real time why disabled people were not included in Minister Badenoch's investigation and what would be published reports across 2020?
I don't know.
And on that, in December 2021, in her final report, I can just read it out, footnote 62 at 89747 at page 32 says this: the impact of COVID-19 on disabled people continues to be monitored across government as part of a separate strand of work to ensure the needs of disabled people are considered in the government's response to and the recovery from COVID-19. This is December 2021, essentially going into the second wave when the footnote was published. Is that not too late in December 2021 to say publicly to be monitoring disproportionate impact on disabled people without a plan?
So we've already extensively covered that in my initial set of evidence, that it takes time to collate data, but it was data that was given as a working presumption across government and across society that those with underlying health conditions and disabilities would be at greater risk of the impacts of COVID. That was a given.
That's it, Mr. Friedman. I'm sorry. You've had substantially over the time allotted.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Sorry.
Oh,
Ms. Davis.
My lady, I hope the stenographer will bear with us for 5 minutes. Mr. Tomlinson, so sorry.
Mr. Tomlinson, I'm asking questions on behalf of Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid, and as you probably know, they're part of the broader violence against women and girls sector. And so my questions are on domestic abuse and disabled people. The inquiry has heard expert evidence, both written and oral, that disabled adults are around 3 times more likely to be subject to domestic abuse than non-disabled adults are. That disabled women are about twice as likely to have experienced sexual violence as non-disabled women. And in all evidence, Professors Shakespeare and Watson said that the stay-at-home orders would certainly have increased the vulnerability of disabled people to domestic abuse. Given that, in the course of your attending the different stakeholders meetings that you've told us about, talking to the stakeholders, were you ever provided with information relating to disabled women being at more risk of domestic abuse?
Not specifically, but DWP as a collective around Universal Credit, other things, Women's Aid, Refuge, other organisations had highlighted that broader point. So I'm not surprised you've said that, in the sense, if it was a given for the wider population, that would then include 1 in 5 people who have a disability. But that, again, would be an example of where, had that come up, had you brought that to me in a stakeholder meeting, we would have then relayed that to the equivalent of myself in the Home Office and said there's a specific area of work to look at if you feel that isn't already being covered by the wider work around domestic abuse. But that would have been a good example of where the disability unit would have then taken that and flagged that.
You said, had it come up. Do you have any recollection of it coming
I don't,
up?
but remember, in all of the wider stakeholder meetings, I'm not present in every one of the meetings, so it could have done. I don't know how the mechanism works. They can go back and look at that. I would be surprised if it hadn't, and I certainly know it came from Women's Aid and Refuge and other organisations on the wider point about domestic violence, so I'm not surprised by what you're saying.
And do you have any personal recollection, it sounds as though you don't, of that relaying happening to the Home Office?
No, but a huge amount will have happened through the Regional Stakeholder Network, the policy teams talking to the charities and organisations policy team. So there's many opportunities where something could do. If it is, there is absolutely no reason why that issue would then not have been shared and flagged. Absolutely not. That's bread and butter. Exactly the sorts of issues that get taken up and then transferred to the relevant department.
But you don't remember that happening?
Not in the meetings that I was present, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Davis. That completes the evidence for today, I think, Mr Keating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Thompson. Sorry to keep you at what's quite a late stage in these proceedings. Very well, 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you, Melanie.